Hi, this is Beth Wadham from the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and welcome to our June webinar on Contemplative Neuroscience. So we're here today with Dr. Richard Davidson. He's at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, so we're delighted to be with Richard Davidson this afternoon. His research has supported the work of the Center for many years, and he's been a colleague of our director, Arthur Zients, in the Mind and Life dialogues with the Dalai Lama. Dr. Davidson has been at the University of Wisconsin since 1984, where he and his work is flourishing. He now directs the Wiseman Lab for Brain Imaging and Behavior, the Laboratory for Effective Neuroscience, and a newly created Center for Investigating Healthy Minds, which just enjoyed the honor of a visit from the Dalai Lama last month. And the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds offers information about contemplative methods that's grounded in research and wisdom traditions, which is really a great service to all of us promoting the development of healthy qualities of mind. So thanks so much for offering this presentation today, Dr. Davidson. I'm really looking forward to it. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to present today. It's my pleasure. What I'd like to do in the short time that we have today is to give the listeners a very brief overview of a new hybrid field that we call Contemplative Neuroscience, and talk a little bit about its origins, and then share with the listeners some data that we've gathered in our own laboratory over the last several years, which has helped to establish this field and has led to the catalyzing of other research throughout the country and the world. Let me begin with a very brief autobiographical interlude, if you will. And just for those listeners that don't know much about my work or about me, I am a psychologist and neuroscientist by training, and I've had a long-standing personal interest in contemplative practice and meditation, and I actually attended my first meditation retreat when I was a graduate student in the mid-1970s, and have maintained a personal commitment to and interest in the area since then. But it was only in 1992 that the possibility of doing serious, rigorous neuroscientific research on meditation and contemplative practice really began to take root. And that was the year in which I first met the Dalai Lama. He invited me to meet with him and a couple of other scientists in the hopes of catalyzing a research effort to investigate the brains of long-term meditation practitioners who had devoted years to cultivating certain healthy qualities of mind. And so in 1992, I went off to Dharamsala, India to meet with His Holiness and discuss this possibility. And His Holiness issued a challenge to me, which was a very provocative one, and basically said that you have, and by you he was meaning the field, has dedicated considerable resources and methodological expertise using modern neuroscientific methods to study qualities like anxiety and fear and depression. And he asked why we could not use the same rigorous scientific methods to study positive qualities of the mind like kindness and compassion. And on that day in 1992, I made a commitment to His Holiness that I was going to come out of the closet with my interest in this area and begin to launch a research program that is focused on these areas. It took some time before that actually got off the ground, but it did get off the ground, and in about 1999, we began to bring long-term practitioners to our laboratory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and began to interrogate brain function that is associated with long-term meditation practice. And what I'd like to do now is just to provide a little bit of a background for this work and then go into more of the details of the work. So there is a remarkable contemporary convergence now, and the convergence is centrally around the idea of neuroplasticity. The word neuroplasticity simply refers to the fact that the brain is the organ that is built to change in response to experience. More than any other idea in modern neuroscience, I would say this is probably the most important over the last several decades. And neuroscientists are discovering the many different mechanisms through which neuroplasticity operates. The fact, though, of neuroplasticity provides the conceptual underpinning for understanding how contemplative practice can change the brain, because we know that it is through experience and through training that the brain undergoes both structural and functional transformation. Another important element in the contemporary convergence is epigenetics. And epigenetics is a major new field of inquiry, and it refers to the study of how genes are modulated by experience and by the environment. It turns out that the extent to which a gene actually is expressed, that is, the extent to which it manufactures the protein for which it is designed, will vary as a function of environmental circumstances. So even though an individual may have a genetic propensity to express a certain kind of behavior, that genetic propensity can actually be modified through experience. We know from studies at the animal level, for example, that the way a mother behaves toward its offspring can very dramatically modulate the expression of certain genes in the brain that are very important in the neurobiology of stress. And a mother who is very nurturant, who expresses a lot of maternal love, can actually change the expression of certain genes that are implicated in the stress cascade and change them for the entire duration of the life of the organism. And this is what is referred to as epigenetics. And we have every reason to think that the genetic profiles of an individual can be modified by training and experience. The third idea is this idea that I've been calling neurally inspired behavioral interventions. And what we mean here is simply the notion that you can actually modulate biology in the brain through specific kinds of interventions, behavioral interventions, that are based upon what we know about brain function. And there are certain kinds of meditation, for example, that have important effects on systems implicated in attention. And those brain systems that are implicated in attention are ones that we might assume would be modulated by certain kinds of behavioral training that operates through those systems. And the research that we and others have been doing clearly establishes that meditation is a type of behavioral intervention that plays a very important role in modulating both attention as well as our capacity to regulate emotion. A third related idea is this idea of putting the brain back into biomedicine, and this is a pathway back into the mind. And we know that there are many diseases that are modulated by psychosocial factors. And if a disease is modulated by, for example, stress in the environment, then we know that those influences somehow get into the brain, and the brain regulates bodily systems that play a role in modulating health and illness. And this framework is a framework that enables us to understand how meditation, by operating on the brain, may actually exert impact on peripheral biological systems, that is, biological systems below the neck, which play a very important role in health and illness. So I'd like to move on now and give the listeners a feel for some of the specific research in which we've been engaged. And one component of that work is focused on compassion. And it was in 1992 that I made a commitment to the Dalai Lama that I was going to do everything I could to put compassion on the scientific map. And one of the ways to do that is by studying long-term meditation practitioners who spent years cultivating compassion as part of their meditation practice. We began this work in a very simple way, and this is illustrated in this slide. And what the viewers can see in this slide is the experimental design that we used, which involved having practitioners alternate between a neutral state and a meditation state repetitively over time throughout an experimental session. So just to continue, and mindful of the fact that you are not able to see slides, what I want to do is just very briefly tell you a little bit about the kind of research that we've done. We have brought long-term practitioners into the laboratory, and these are all individuals who have spent a minimum of 10,000 hours in their lifetime practicing, and the actual range of practice in this study went from approximately 12,000 to 62,000 lifetime hours of practice. And participants came into the laboratory, and we assessed their brain function with both brain electrical activity measures as well as with functional magnetic resonance imaging to look at different features of brain function. And we discovered that the brain is profoundly changed when a practitioner is meditating on compassion. There are rhythms in the brain that are in the gamma frequency band. This is very fast oscillations that are approximately 40 cycles per second, and these oscillations are expressed very prominently and synchronously throughout multiple regions of the brain when practitioners are generating compassion. We also find that there are specific areas of the brain that are activated that we can detect with functional MRI when the practitioners are generating compassion, and there is activation specifically in an area of the brain called the insula, which is a very interesting area of the brain because it has representation of different visceral organs in the insula. It is a central location, a convergence zone in the brain that enables signals from the body to be relayed to the brain and signals from the brain to be relayed to the body. So it sits at the nexus of some very important brain-body interaction. And what we find is that during the meditation on compassion, we present emotional sounds to practitioners, and particularly during negative emotional sounds. You can think of this as sounds of human suffering. The practitioners express very high levels of activation in the insula. One of the questions which we are frequently asked when I talk about this work is people say, well, this is all well and good, but there's no way that I will ever be able to practice for this length of time. And the question that we're always asked is whether much shorter amounts of practice make a difference. And in order to address that, we've done many different kinds of studies, but one particularly relevant study is one that is been conducted in our lab very, very recently, and it's a study of very short-term compassion training over the course of just 2 weeks of time, where practitioners practice for 30 minutes a day a guided meditation.
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
Training that was derived from cognitive therapy. We did brain scans on these participants before and after they underwent this 2 weeks of compassion or cognitive reappraisal training, and we examined the extent to which this short-term training actually changed the brain. We also administered certain kinds of tasks that reflect altruism and kindness and cooperation. These are tasks that are derived from behavioral and neuroeconomics. And we found in this study that indeed even short amounts of practice, in this case over the course of just 2 weeks, makes a significant difference in terms of both the brain as well as behavioral changes. And moreover, we found that among those participants, the biggest change on our measure of altruism designed from behavioral economics. Those are recent findings which reveal that even short amounts of practice, in this case just 2 weeks of practice in individuals who are completely meditation naive, is enough to produce demonstrable changes in the brain and behavior. I want to mention that, and end with this on this area, and that is examining what effects meditation may have on peripheral biology, that is biology below the neck, that may be consequential for health. And here we have, again, done a variety of different kinds of studies. In one early study that we did with John Kabat-Zinn, where we evaluated the impact of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a program that John Kabat-Zinn developed that is presented in 2 months with participants attending a weekly class of about 2.5 hours once a week for 2 months, as well as doing daily practice. We found that individuals who underwent a 2-month trial of MBSR showed a significant boost in immune function. And the way we measured it in this study is that we gave participants in both the mindfulness-based stress reduction group as well as in a control group a flu shot at the end of the study, and we took blood samples to ascertain the magnitude of response of the flu vaccine. We can do this by looking at the antibody titers mounted in response to the vaccine. And we found that, in this case, 2 months of meditation practice was enough to actually produce a statistically significant difference in the impact of the flu vaccine on the immune system. Those who went through the meditation program showed a bigger boost in immune function compared with those in a control group. So these findings indicate that 2 months of meditation practice are enough to produce significant changes in a bodily system which is critically implicated in physical health. So I want to just end by reflecting a little bit about where this work is going in the future and what it might bring. The work that we and others are doing leads to the suggestion that mental exercise is an activity which can change the brain and the body in ways that are as, if not more profound, than physical exercise. And it's my conjecture that in the future, mental exercise will be accepted and practiced in the same way that physical exercise is today. I also believe that this and related work is leading to a science of virtuous qualities. No longer will neuroscience be exclusively focused on the dark side of life. One of the important intuitions that is receiving some empirical support from this work is the idea that health is not simply the absence of disease, and that we can actually cultivate truly healthy minds, which are not minds that simply have no illness, but they are minds which express important virtuous qualities like the capacity to focus attention, the maintenance of equanimity, and the display of kindness and compassion. I also think that this work will lead us to incorporate the mind back into medicine and enable us to better understand how the brain can modulate peripheral biology excuse me, in ways that can affect health. And I think that one of the implications of this work is that it will lead us to take more responsibility for our own health. And finally, this work is leading to the incorporation of modalities of contemplative practice in the schools, in the K through 12 age ranges, when the brain is still very much developing. And it is during this time where we believe that the brain actually is most sensitive to training, and training during this time will likely have a more significant and a more enduring impact. One of the areas that our own center is committed to exploring in the near future is how we can translate these practices to kids, for example, in elementary school, to help lay the foundation for successful regulation of attention and successful regulation of emotion, two important qualities which will serve children extremely well as they navigate the difficult trajectory of adolescence. So this is an area where at the present point in time there's very little evidence, but we hope that over the next few years there will be an increasing array of studies that will provide some clues as to how we can do this in children and what kind of impact it might have. So I want to just end by saying that in our own institution at the University of Wisconsin, in order to catalyze our efforts, as Beth mentioned in her introduction, we have recently launched the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds, and on May 16th of this last month, we had our formal opening, which was attended by the Dalai Lama, along with John Kabat-Zinn, Dan Goleman, and many other dignitaries. For those of you who are interested in this work, I would encourage you to visit our website. Our website is www.investigatinghealthyminds.org. That is www.investigatinghealthyminds, that's all one word, .org. And you can read all about our center. And the vision of our center is to create a world through research and outreach in which healthy qualities of mind are investigated and valued. And so let me end here, and I will be happy to take questions from the listeners. Hopefully I'll be able to read those questions, although I'm not quite sure given the technical difficulties we've had. But I'll pause here and see if Beth wants to join in.
Hi, yeah, and thank you. The question pane can be kind of dislodged from the control panel, Dr. Davidson, so you can expand it. And I'll just address our listeners for a couple minutes. While you do that, there are some wonderful questions there.
Let me just say that nothing I do is affecting this. So
okay.
I can't read anything.
Oh, we seem to have come up against a lot of obstacles today. Well, why don't I read some of the questions? We've also, I just want to say, had many suggestions from our listeners who have had experiences with webinars before about ways to solve this problem. I guess we're just rolling on and, you know, with what difficulties we do have, and hopefully, you know, you have found this illuminating, and we can open up the conversation now if I read the questions, Dr. Davidson, and then you can answer them. So there's a question from Rick Rapetti from Kingsborough College at Partakuni. Your work seems to show that purely mental activities like meditation actually alter brain structure and function. Do you think this counts as evidence at all for the possibility that mind is at least partly non-physical?
Well, I appreciate the question, and it's a very difficult question, and a question which would take us a considerable length of time to really thoroughly vet. Let me simply say that the mainstream view in neuroscience is that mind is an emergent property of the brain, and therefore dependent upon the brain. But certainly our work does show that altering the mind can actually change the brain. But this really is a very deep question, and some of the contemplative traditions have something to say about this, which poses an important challenge to neuroscientists. And for those of you who are particularly interested in this question, one of the interesting discussions of it that I would encourage listeners and viewers to read is in the Dalai Lama's book called The Universe in a Single Atom, which is his discussion of science and spirituality, and he takes on this issue in a very provocative way. I'll simply say that at the present point in time, we just don't have evidence on one side or another to really adjudicate this issue.
Yeah, that's a very lively point. There's another question from Jason Kaufman. He says, I would be curious to know Dr. Davidson's working definition of compassion. Has he sought to quantify it?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a continuously moving target. As the work progresses, we are attempting to get better definitions of it. But let me also say that I believe that in order to achieve scientific progress, it's not necessary that we fully define compassion, because in fact the definition will emerge as the research goes forward. But provisionally, I would say that compassion is a complex mental state that arises in response to others' suffering and is focused on the relieving of the suffering of another. And I think that that focus on relieving the suffering of another is a very critical component of compassion that distinguishes it from a near neighbor, which is empathy. And empathy does not necessarily have this component of wishing that suffering be relieved.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. There's also a question from Jeremy Hunter who says, can you describe the compassion training itself?
I certainly can describe the compassion training, and if the slides were working, you would have seen presented it. But very briefly, the compassion training entails having participants contemplate and visualize the suffering, and then the wishing the freedom from that suffering for a number of different classes of people, beginning with a loved one. So most people find that it is easy or easier to do this for a loved one. So they might imagine a family member, a spouse, and imagine a time when they were suffering, and hold that vision in mind, visualize the person as she or he might have been suffering, and then have the aspiration that they be relieved from that suffering. We instruct the participants to use a phrase which they silently, mentally repeat. A standard phrase might be, may you be free from suffering, may you experience joy and ease. Participants are instructed to notice visceral sensations that accompany this practice, especially sensations in the area of the heart. And they're also instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat the phrases cognitively. And after doing this for a loved one, they then move on to themselves. And then after that, they move on to a stranger. And by a stranger here, we mean someone that the individual sees on a regular basis. It may be a bus driver. It may be a colleague that they run into almost every day, but they really have never stopped to talk with them. They're instructed to visualize that individual and visualize a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and then go through the phrase, again, may you be free from suffering, may you experience joy and ease, and so forth. And then from there, they move on to a difficult person, someone who really pushes your buttons and who makes you angry. And again, for the difficult person, visualize the time when they may have been suffering and then wish that they be free from that suffering. And finally, one moves on to all beings and does this practice for all beings. And that's the core elements of the training, and this was done every day for 30 minutes a day.
Wonderful. We have a question from Dennis Novak that reads, I teach empathetic communication to medical students. There are clearly differences in empathetic capacities among students, no doubt reflecting differences in neural organization, including densities of mirror neurons. Do you suppose we can increase mirror neuron density with training?
It's a very good question, and I would say that we don't know the answer to that at all. The work on mirror neurons is very interesting work. For those listeners that don't know what mirror neurons are, they are specific cells in the brain that were originally discovered in monkeys, and these cells appear to respond when an individual, him or herself, engages in a specific action, and the same cells seem to respond when a person views another person engaged in that action. There are some scientists who've speculated that mirror neurons may be an important constituent for the experience of empathy. Having said that, it's also the case that it's very difficult to make rigorous inferences about the presence of mirror neurons in a human brain because we are limited to non-invasive methods for the interrogation of brain function. And the way mirror neurons actually are identified is by recording from those actual neurons, which cannot readily be done in humans. So there are some methodological challenges in the study of mirror neurons in humans, but it's a very interesting area that is receiving a lot of attention today.
Thank you. Susan Rosen has a question. Have they measured long-term effects of compassion training with longitudinal data?
No. There are no good studies that have been done to date of long-term training in compassion. This is something that needs to be done. Really, the most that has been looked at is training over the course of 3 months, but in that case, the training was not exclusively compassion meditation. So this is a study which is really crying out to be done. It just has not been done yet.
Much more to do. Deborah Haynes asks, would you say a few words about how your own contemplative practice has evolved during these 3+ decades of your engagement with meditation?
Well, I would say that my own contemplative practice has become an increasingly more important part of my life, and the research only underscores its value. I didn't originally start meditating because of the scientific evidence that it was a good thing to do. I started meditating because I found that there were quite a few people who I had the great fortune to spend time around who were wonderful people and had really infectious kindness that attracted me to them. And one of the things I learned is that they had in common that they meditated. And so that's something that inspired me to begin my own meditation practice. And the scientific research certainly underscores, for me, its value. And I also see that the process of engaging in a meditation practice and the process of doing science share some very important similarities. Both require rigorous discipline. Both are dedicated to a kind of radical honesty about one's perceptions of the world. Both are dedicated to seeing things clearly in an unbiased way. And so when science is practiced at its highest levels and really done right, I think it shares a lot with contemplative practice.
It's been a wonderful convergence with for your career. Yeah. Paul Crow asks whether you could comment on how essential Buddhist doctrine and praxis are for achieving the results you describe. People are sensitive to the matter of religion in schools, and he wonders whether meditation can be stripped of a fundamentally or explicitly Buddhist orientation without losing something essential.
I believe that meditation can be presented in a completely secular way in the absence of its religious context and have great benefit for people. This is something that the Dalai Lama has strongly advocated, and it's something that scientific research, I think, is clearly supporting, given the extant research to date. So I believe that it is possible, and I think there's increasing evidence that is being gathered today that will speak to this issue as well. Certainly to present these kinds of methods in school systems, public school systems especially, will require that they be absolutely non-religious and completely secular. And I believe they can be, and I believe we will still see some benefit.
Right, and that nothing essential really is lost, or, yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say anything essential is lost. Whether there are non-essential things that are lost, that's a different story, and I think there may well be, but I don't think they're essential.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a question from, it's Jeremy Hunter again. How do you deal with those who a priori don't see compassion as a good or desirable thing?
Well, I would say that everyone sees happiness as a good or desirable thing, whether they say so or not. I think that there is a universal aspiration to be happy. I think that this is part of our biological heritage. And I think that the behavior of organisms clearly indicates. And if that's true, I also believe that probably the most effective way in which to achieve enduring and genuine happiness is to express increasing levels of compassion. And so I think that if a person really understands this and spends even just a little bit of time reflecting on it, I think they will see the value of it.
Right, outside of believing one thing or another.
Yeah, I don't think it requires belief in anything.
No. Great. Okay, here is one from Paul Crow. Oh, no. We already did that one. We have Jason Kaufman. Given the wealth of the relevant literature, do you have any plans to extend your research in meditation into areas of clinical hypnosis or guided visual imagery? Are you aware of any such research being done?
There certainly is research in guided imagery that is being done, and some of the meditation practices that we study actually involve the generation of imagery. But our plate is quite full, and certainly these are worthy topics, but ones that we are unlikely to take on at any point soon just because of the plethora of activity in which we are currently engaged.
Right. Thank you. All right, we have just time for a couple more questions. And one of them is, Dr. Davidson, would you be willing to do the presentation again with the slides, or at least post them somehow, possibly through our website? Well, we can talk about maybe having the PowerPoint available for people to review, and certainly we'd like to post some of the references that Dr. Davidson has made, of course, to his own website, and the book he mentioned by the Dalai Lama. Again, we're very sorry that we weren't able to follow through with the full features of the webinar. So we'll discuss that outside of this discussion. But let's see, we can take another question from Marianne Marshall, who says, are you aware of any work that has been done investigating the role of contemplative practices in frontline care providers, specifically child care providers? How, for example, is meditation allows providers to be present with children?
Yeah, it's a wonderful area of application. I don't know of any research that's specifically been done on the application of meditation to child care providers. There's a little bit of work that's been done on the application of meditation practices to teachers who, of course, do have children in their care. And there are several projects that are going on now, both in the U.S. and in other countries, where teachers are being trained in these practices, and the impact of that training on both the teachers as well as the kids is evaluated. And there's a little bit of research which has already been published suggesting that this potentially could be beneficial. But it's in the very early stages.
Nice. And I'll take one final question from John Byer, who asks, if meditation causes neurophysical brain strengthening and facilitation of attentional areas in the brain, what video games, video commercials, sound bites, and short attention span sensory inputs do to the rewiring of the brain with repeated exposure? Whole other area of study.
Yeah, it's a very good question. There are a few studies that have been done on the impact of video games, and there is actually a diversity of video games, and I would say that it's not probably accurate to characterize all of them as presenting information in extremely short sound bites and cultivating a kind of sporadic attention. I actually have been working over the last 6 months with a group here at the University of Wisconsin. In our School of Education, we have one of the top programs for the application of video games to educational and pro-social purposes. And there is a lot of interest in actually using that medium as a complement to help strengthen the kinds of qualities that we're talking about being cultivated through contemplative practice. This is an area that I think will be investigated much more over the next several years, but it's really ripe, I think, for exploration. Clearly, our youth are spending a very significant portion of their time on these games, and if we can't beat them, we should join them and see if we can harness this technology for the greater good.
Yeah, it seems like there are these creative ways to work inside of those frameworks. And
right.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for being present and moving forward without going into a kind of uncertain situation here. And thank you all for staying with us. I really appreciated listening to all that Dr. Davidson had to say about his research and his experience, and just illuminating many of these topics for us. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Davidson. Thanks to everyone for being part of the webinar today. And this completes our webinar series for this year, so we're going out with a bang. And we'll be beginning again in September with monthly presentations from contemplative practice fellows and other leaders in contemplative education. And we will do our best to scrap what we have here and put it up on the website in a form that has some other resources available for you to follow up on this topic. And that will be all for today. All right, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.